Welcome to the 5th Anniversary Celebration Podcast and PRI's Next Round. I'm Rowena and Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. Tim, I can't believe it's been 5 years. Who knew we would still be up and running 5 years later? So we thought that we'd take this time, 5th year anniversary, and look at the highlights and the lowlights of the last 5 years.
And there are definitely some highlights and lowlights, as you will all hear over the next few moments.
Well, but before we do that, let me start by just chatting a little bit about the history and how we came about having our podcast. It was 2017, and I believe it was the same year that we started Right by the Bay, our blog. And Tim just joined us a few months earlier. And I thought with Tim leading PRI's marketing effort, it would be a good time to come up with some new ideas, push the envelope a little bit. So the two new ideas I had was to start a blog and a podcast. And I mentioned it to Sally Pipes, our president, and her husband, Charles Kessler, who we were all having lunch at the time. And Charles suggested that we call our podcast Another Round and that we hold it at a bar somewhere. Well, that seemed like a big to-do to have it at a bar. We didn't even have any equipment. We didn't even know how to do it at the time. So I thought I'd leave the bar idea out. And we named our podcast Another Round, as Charles suggested. A few months into it, I got a scary email from BuzzFeed saying that they already owned that name. And sure enough, they did. There was a really popular podcast called Another Round, hosted by two gals. So we had to call our lawyers, sort it all out. And we ended up changing our name from Another Round to Next Round. And now we own the trademark for Next Round. But the sad thing, of course, is that we really liked Another Round. And since then, the old BuzzFeed podcast they've gone away. But folks, we're all still here.
I remember when we were starting, the work we had to go through, just figuring out how do you do it. I had lunch with my friend from the Capitol, Martin Ashley, who ran our radio studio, and he gave me a crash course in here's the equipment that you need to buy. Here's how you edit a podcast. Here's some things that you need to think about, things that I wouldn't have thought about, like regularity. If you say you're going to have a podcast every week on a Tuesday, you better have it every week on a Tuesday. The feel of it should be the same. If you have one person as the host, that person should be the host every week. The music, the format, all of it should be the consistency that jarring to the listeners if you don't have some sort of consistency. And editing, that has certainly been trial and error, but it's a lot easier and faster for me to edit it now. It used to take me forever to edit these pieces, but we must be doing something right if we're still here 5 years later.
That's right. And Tim, you calculated some numbers on who's been around the most.
Well, I was curious when we started kind of looking back over the past 5 years to see who are the top guests on our podcast. You hear about Johnny Carson or David Letterman, which celebrity was on the most. I think Regis Philbin was the number one guest on David Letterman. I think he was on over 100 times. We don't have that many thus far, but I will say to those of you who are guessing, if you had Lance Azumi in your pool for the number one all-time guest, you were right. Lance has been on 40 times over the past 5 years, followed in a somewhat close second by our Wayne Weingarten, who's been on 35 times, and then Kerry Jackson, who's been on 29 times. And then it falls off quite a bit. The next most is our Steve Greenhut has been on 11 times, and our Sally Pipes has been on 10. Who will be the number one guest over the next 5 years? You'll have to keep listening to find out.
Tim, I think we might have to put that in context, because that doesn't mean that Lance has had 40 appearances. A lot of times, Lance and Wayne and Kerry were on the all-star panel team. And so, folks, that doesn't mean that Lance had 40 appearances and you heard him for 40 weeks, which would be close to a year of Lance.
And in some cases, Lance actually was doing the interviewing. Wayne as well. They've actually interviewed guests. So in going through the podcast, I thought it was fun that we would take a look back at the first episode of our podcast. And actually, this is one of the things that we learned when starting the podcast, is that you shouldn't just have one episode when you launch. That for whatever reason, I don't know if it's psychology or what, that you have to have more than just one bit of content for people to get interested and start coming back. So we actually had 3 first episodes of our podcast. So we had Joe Quirk, who heads something called the Seasteading Institute, which is kind of it's a libertarian project where it'd be like the libertarian dream come true. You'd actually be living on like a floating island or barge out somewhere, and you would be able to live as you wish without the heavy hand of government dictating your every move. And he has a book on the subject as well that's interesting.
And Peter Thiel was one of the original funders of Seasteading, and we wanted kind of some quirky guests, off the wall ideas. And we thought it would be fun to kind of set the tone with this kind of unusual idea, seasteading with, floating libertarian cities off the coast of California.
So then we had Lance for his first appearance right off the bat, where he talked about, I can't believe this book came out 5 years ago, but his book, The Corrupt Classroom, which made huge national waves. And we heard about it all first on Then Another Round. And then our other first episode, and I guess we'll get into our predictions later, but I guess we were pretty stellar in spotting young talent then. Our other first guest was Assemblyman James Gallagher, who's now the Assembly Republican leader and someone who is definitely on the rise here in Sacramento.
Yeah, and we have to thank Assemblyman Gallagher for taking a chance on us. We had never done a podcast before. I think we should be proud of that podcast, and we're very proud that Assemblyman Gallagher is now the minority leader.
So, Ro, are you ready to cringe?
No, not really, Tim, but go for it.
So the most entertaining part of going back is to see, remember the old cigarette ads where we've come a long way, baby? Well, we've come a long way, baby, in our podcast. And I thought I would pull a couple of clips from our first episodes to see just how better we have gotten at this. So this first clip is Ro giving the lead in on one of our first episodes. So see what you think of this.
On this episode of Another Round, we're talking about rural California. Rural communities like those in the North State are the epicenter of California's water woes. Making matters worse, earlier this year, they experienced a great water emergency with the Oroville Dam crisis. PRI's Director of Communications, Tim Anaya, recently sat down with North State Assemblyman James Gallagher. Assemblyman Gallagher is a family farmer, attorney, and former Sutter County supervisor. He is the vice chair of the Assembly Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee. They talked about the state's response to the Oroville Dam emergency, efforts to build more water storage in California, and a proposal to give the North State a bigger voice in state government. Assembly Gallagher talked with Tim in his office at the state capitol in Sacramento.
No, stop. I had my fingers for half of it in my, stuck in my ear. But actually, I think we improved over that because I did think that in the beginning, we were a little too formal. Maybe mid-course, we decided to have a little kind of chat, which is what our format is now.
Well, you are not the only one who has improved dramatically over time. Listen to this. This is me asking a question on an early episode. And if you fall asleep during this, I think you will not be alone.
Carrie, I think lawmakers would be well advised to look at your great housing brief, Unaffordable, and look to there for some ideas for really good policy reforms that would make a significant difference if enacted in letting the market play a bigger role in housing and letting market forces take shape in increasing housing supply and increasing housing affordability.
I mean, did I not wake up that week?
Well, now we talk like normal people.
That's right.
Well, what we didn't say about that first interview with Lance Izumi is that it was actually the second interview with Lance Izumi because we had a funky equipment failure and we had to retape that whole podcast. And Lance still teases us because he says, you guys lost that podcast and it was my Oscar-winning performance.
I mean, it was so bad. I mean, you have no idea how bad it was. But that was not the only snafu that we had. I remember one time we were in Vancouver PRI and the Intercollegiate Studies Institute at George Mason University, we put up together a conference on free market environmentalism in Vancouver. And while we were there, we interviewed Marlo Lewis, the great free market environmentalist from Competitive Enterprise Institute, and had my little digital recorder, which is how I tape the podcast when I actually go on site to interview someone in person. And I didn't pay attention. You have a memory card in them, so you're limited with how much space. And I didn't pay attention that the memory card was almost full. So actually, we probably only got about 2/3 of our interview because it ran out of memory. And what was sad was there actually was some really good stuff in the part that was left on the cutting room floor, including Marlo Lewis is was it a guitar player?
Yeah, I think he didn't drink. So he passed on our question about recommending a wine or a beer or a cocktail. And he said, but I've got one for you. He loved playing his guitar and he loved rock music.
So we missed all of that. But now, all these years later, you know all about that.
What drove me crazy was Skype, frankly. And we used to use Skype to connect with our guests. And even though we would follow all of the same exact steps, sometimes Skype wouldn't work. And it was kind of embarrassing, actually, because even though we felt like we did everything right, we still had trouble connecting every now and then.
And it's actually kind of complicated to tape with Skype because we had to be in the digital recorder and tape it in Audacity as well. So I had to merge two files together. So thank goodness for Zoom that makes it so much easier. But we had this problem, and I don't know if we had a setting wrong or what was going on, but it wouldn't tape the audio. It would tape ours asking the question, but it wouldn't tape the audio of the speaker. Row started taping them on her phone just to make sure we wouldn't lose out on a great episode. And we actually had it happen in a great episode with one of our board members, Larry Siskin, and his daughter, Sarah Rose Siskin, who we'll talk about her in a little bit. And it was a great kind of father and daughter back and forth on sort of the issues of the day and their approaches to life. And we got it. You can hear it. But boy, the audio, I cringe when I hear that episode.
Yeah. And Tim, why did it always have to happen when we had big guests, like Michael Anton or I remember Jason Riley? I didn't get the audio just right. He was speaking at one of our conferences on his book on Tom Sowell, and that didn't record properly. But Tim, you got to talk about Kevin McCarthy.
So we lined up a big guest for our 100th episode, my former boss, House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy. We had it set up by Skype, and he wanted to call in. So I even set it up so he could figure out how to call in. Well, for whatever reason, it would not connect to Row. So he actually, Skype hung up on him 2 or 3 times because I could not, for the life of me, bring Row into the call. So finally I just said, and he was gracious enough to keep calling back. Finally I said, we'll just edit her in later. So those of you at home, you probably were none the wiser that Row's questions were edited in later, but
I was never there, folks.
He was never there, but it ended up being a pretty good and memorable episode. And you'll hear a clip from that in a little bit.
Yes. And special thanks to Kevin McCarthy for putting up with us. He's very gracious about it.
So let's go to our favorite guests. And I know for you, your favorite guest is the great futurist, George Gilder. Let's hear a little clip of what he had to say, and then tell us a little bit about why he was important to you to have on the podcast.
In your opinion, what is the state of Silicon Valley today?
Well, I think it's in the process of having a nervous breakdown. It's completely failed to supply security for its products. And security is an optional in a system that actually focuses on transactions. And the only answer of Silicon Valley to the breakdown of security manifested everywhere with millions of usernames, passwords, expiration dates, social security numbers lost is to demand more passwords or more complicated passwords or more intricate, interconnected passwords. And the whole system has collapsed. And while Silicon Valley speaks of attaining some singularity where human brains are transcended and machine intelligence, I think it's a combination of delusions of grandeur and a collapse of the actual technology that they are responsible for maintaining.
Well, Tim, the reason why George Gilder is a favorite of mine is because I read Wealth and Poverty back in college. And this book, combined with Jude Wanniski's The Way the World Works and The Laffer Curve, changed my life and shaped the way I thought about economics. And I became a free marketer thanks to George Gilder. So it was a big thrill for me to be able to interview George Gilder, one of my heroes. And I interviewed him at a conference. And he had just been on a long run. He's a lifelong runner, and he was very gracious and down to earth. And folks, I was starstruck. Well, and another one that stands out for me is Lord Jamie Borwick, the fifth Baron Borwick. And I had to practice saying that because it's spelled Borwick, but pronounced Borwick. Lord Borwick's topic was Britain, Brexit, Boris, and Borwick. And he was very charming. And gosh, I remember that one because I had never interviewed a real Lord before. And also my other favorite is Clark Judge, who's the chairman of the board, runs the White House Writers Group, and is also a regular guest. And he's been my friend for more than 40 years.
Clark has been on 5 times,
Oh.
just for the record. I have a couple, and you can really tell the relationship that I have with these people when you hear the clip. So first is, and for those who know me, you would not be surprised by this, is now Congresswoman Connie Conway, who is, one of my favorite all-time people. And, I've had the pleasure to work for her for several years when she was Assembly Republican leader, and is one of the most entertaining people you could ever hear. And I think this quote shows her humor, but also you can tell the trouble that we get into together when we start talking.
It reminds me of our friend Brian Jones always had those commentaries, "Are you kidding me?"
You've got to be kidding me.
Yes. He had a point there.
Well, as I like to say, you can't make this stuff up.
Yes.
That's just a little example. We were talking about the craziness of Sacramento, but one of the most entertaining people you would ever meet is Connie Conway. The other one that I selected, which was probably one of my all-time favorite podcasts, is with Steve Maviglio, who's one of the top Democrat political communicators, worked in the Gray Davis administration. He worked for Speaker Fabian Nunez, which is where he and I got to know one another. We kind of reminisced a little bit about the good old days, and we would and continue to good-naturedly rib one another. We had him on for an episode that we called The Broken Clock is Right Twice Hour, because he actually agreed with us on a couple of the issues that he was working on. But Steve is one of the best, and I think you'll get a kick out of this little clip here.
We worked together in the legislature way back in the day. I call it the good old days, when Fabian Nunez was speaker and Mike Valines was the Republican leader, and we would bash one another all day long and what our bosses were doing. But
yeah, your definition of together is interesting. I just remember sitting in the back of the chamber and sniping about our members of each party and their respective dumb comments when they were given.
And that is so true, because all they do, staff knows the things that are said on the assembly floor, some of which I had a hand in drafting, are not, it's no substitute for the oratory of Winston Churchill, let's just say. Next, we have grouped together some different collection of clips by category. I thought was kind of interesting. So our first one are the newsmakers, the people. It's always great to have people who are on the ground and telling you what's going on from their perspective. And selfishly for us, it's never a bad thing if someone's going to make some news while being on our podcast. And one of those people, as we mentioned before, was House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy. And we talked with him about some of the lessons that he learned from his time in Sacramento and how it guides him in Washington. And when you hear his answer, I think it gives you a preview of how he would be as Speaker of the House.
You know, I never forget where I come from, Tim and Rowena. One thing I realized, Sacramento taught you a lot because we did a lot of things by what was called the Big Five. I realized I was not in the majority, but that didn't mean you didn't have good ideas. It didn't mean that you didn't fight for your ideas. And lots of times we won in those situations. Government is not designed where one side gets 100% of what they want. You've got to find common ground. And I'm willing to work with anyone who wants to work to make the future better than today. That tomorrow is better than the day that we had before. So when I sit down, I listen. I also am not shy about putting an idea forward. And I also am not afraid if somebody else brings another idea forward. But finding ways that we can find compromise and always keeping to my principle, but finding a way to solve a problem.
Another interesting guest that we had during the heat of the 2020 election, we had John Barger, who is a member of the U.S. Postal Service Board of Governors. And if you remember back then, there was a huge controversy over is President Trump politicizing the Postal Service? And will we get our ballots on time? And is that a way that he would somehow try to cling to power? And we had John Barger on, who's the brother of LA County Supervisor Catherine Barger. And, we asked him directly, do we have anything to worry about? Will we get our ballots on time? And I think he was quite clear with our listeners. The Postal Service is here to serve the American people.
There's an old African saying that when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And I think that there is a meta-narrative that the Postal Service somehow is involved in the outcome of the election when nothing's been further from the case. The Postal Service is a bipartisan run organization with dedicated employees, 630,000 of them, who serve every nook and cranny of this country and who intend to carry out their civic duty. We view the Postal Service as a service to the American people. We are not a business, although we try to run like a business from the standpoint of being self-sufficient, self-sustaining. We're making efforts to achieve that. But in the meantime, the American people should be absolutely assured that on a bipartisan basis, our board of Republicans and Democrats is absolutely committed and confident.
So, Tim, I always like to have guests from Washington, people on the ground there, and really understanding what the nation's thinking is, especially from a Washingtonian standpoint. And in this case, we had Michael Anton. And Michael, as many of you know, was a big secret back then, was the author of Flight 93. But what many people don't know about Michael is that, yes, he knows a lot about National Security Council affairs, where he advised President Trump. But he's a bit of a philosopher and very much in touch with the culture and the climate of America. And here's his comment here about intersectionality and wokeism.
Their coalition is inherently unstable, and it's basically united by the revenge fantasy. So many aspects of the coalition, elements of that coalition, either don't like one another and or see things through this intersectionality lens. And so the whole question for them is who ranks higher on the intersectionality totem pole, and they fight over that. No, it's me. I outrank you. I'm more of a victim than you. You're right. They've redefined virtue and worth as level of present and historic victimization, and then they all want to fight over, who gets to be the boss based on that. And that's a centrifugal force that's pulling their coalition apart.
My other favorite is Steve Moore. And he, as you know, as our listeners know, he was an advisor to President Trump on his economic plan. And Steve Moore graciously comes to California every now and then to speak to our supporters. And here's a clip of Steve in one of our luncheons.
One of the key principles of Trumponomics that Larry Kudlow and I and Arthur Laffer always talked about when we would, meet with Trump during the campaign and we were his senior economic advisors was focus on growth, get the economy growing faster. And so many of these other problems that we face as a country, whether it's our big deficits, our debt, income inequality, poverty, all of those problems are so much easier to solve if you have more growth. So Trump, I think, has been focused like a laser beam on how to make the American economy grow faster.
Ro, can you imagine hearing those comments today? If we had a president who focused on economic growth, where we would be at today. So our next category are our favorite authors. And, regular listeners of Next Round know that we have a lot of authors on, and we have more authors planned for our upcoming episodes. So the first one that I thought was interesting is Robbie Soave, who is an interesting guy. And he was the author of the new book at the time, Panic Attack, kind of explained this rise of wokeism and intersectionality and these terms that we had no idea what they were before, but now are all too familiar with. And he really broke down for us, how do young people come to expect, that college would be a safe space and demand all of these, even limits on free speech to protect their safety. Here's what he has to say.
School sort of changed, or the vision of what school is, has been changing since I think the late 1990s to be about producing feelings of safety to what I might term an unreasonable degree of safety, often in response to violence that has taken place in schools. I think it's not an accident that the Columbine shooting, which took place at the very end of the 90s, happened amidst a time of tightening laws about having weapons in schools and adding metal detectors and security cameras and actually placing police in schools. If you go back to the 1970s, there was not a single police officer in any school in America. Now there are police officers in like half of public high schools. What is a school? It's like a daycare where we're keeping everyone very, 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 very safe, I think became the prevailing view of school. Even though schools were always very safe places, the incidents of violence that have caught the media's attention and were terrible, are very, very rare occurrences. So that sort of makes the environment of school, I think, different for the people who went through school maybe shortly after I did.
And I highly recommend his book, Panic Attack. If you're not sure what all of the wokeism means today, you will learn a lot reading Robbie Soave's book. The other author who I really enjoyed talking to was Glenn Reynolds, who's the founder of Instapundent, and he wrote a terrific book on how the private sector And he wrote a terrific book on how the private sector can really take advantage of the opportunities space exploration presents to us so much more effectively than the public sector could do. And here he kind of breaks down the advantages that private firms have in space exploration and development versus the public sector.
Unlike a government space program, if they test a rocket and it blows up, they just figure out why it blew up and test another rocket, and it's not the material of congressional hearings. They can afford to fail and to learn from their failures. And they have a very strong incentive to make it cheaper because that's what their customers want. When you are funded by the government, especially if it's a cost plus contract, you really have no incentive to make things cheaper. And as a result, government contractors very seldom do.
Well, my favorite authors, the first one is Melanie Kirkpatrick, who wrote the book on Thanksgiving and the biography of Sarah Josepha Hale, who was a remarkable woman in the early history of the United States. Her name is kind of lost to history now. We have Melanie to thank for bringing her back and bringing her story back. She was the editor of the largest women's publication in her day. She composed the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb. She championed making Thanksgiving a federal holiday. She brought polka to the United States. She also popularized the white wedding dress. So here's Melanie chatting about Sarah Josepha Hale.
She was a household name in the 19th century. And I say in the book, I think she was the most influential woman of the century and one of the most influential women in American history. Everybody knew her name. There was a book, for example, of a cookbook that she wrote, and it was called Mrs. Hale's New Cookbook, I believe. And you didn't have to say who she was because everybody knew her name. I learned about her when I wrote a history of the American holiday of Thanksgiving. And I learned about her because Sarah Hale is known as the godmother of Thanksgiving. It was she who persuaded Lincoln to issue a Thanksgiving proclamation calling for a national day of Thanksgiving in 1863. She had been writing to presidents for 2 decades before Lincoln did this. And she also had been campaigning for a national day of Thanksgiving in her magazine, Godey's Ladies Book, which was the most popular magazine of the pre-Civil War period.
My other favorite author was Matt Hennessy, who many of you may know that he is one of the opinion editors at the Wall Street Journal. He wrote this great book on economics, kind of a economics 101 for young people. And it's written by a non-economist. Matt is not a PhD in economics. And I thought it was a terrific book. And we had him for the podcast.
I spent the first part of my life, with my nose in a CD case, just listening to music, reading books, and pretending to be a poet. And I don't think I'm the only English major out there who has done his level best to keep economics at bay. So that's why I wrote this book, because I think there's a lot of people who would like to have a little introduction to economics in a painless sort of a way, and maybe even have a few laughs along the way.
So we had a lot of nonfiction writers here, but I wanted to do a shout out to our friend Harry Crocker. He is the executive editor at Regnery Publishing, and he's the author of a fiction book, Custer of the West. That's a series and several other books. And we interviewed him on the state of conservative publishing.
So our next category is funny people. And believe it or not, a podcast on policy issues and politics. Well, we enjoy to have a good time and laugh a bit as well. So one of the most interesting interviews I thought was with two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning political cartoonist Michael Ramirez. And we had the opportunity both to interview him, and he's spoken at a PRI event in San Francisco in the past. And here he shares how he got on the path to becoming a political cartoonist.
One day I was carrying a painting that I was working on into the New University, which was our college newspaper's office. And I was filing a story. My editor said, I didn't know you could draw. Why don't you do a political cartoon on the student election? And so in seeing these guys and looking at their stands, they had no real platform they were running on. It was more of a popularity contest. So I did a cartoon making fun of all the candidates. And sure enough, when that image hit the newsstands, we had 3 days of protests over this cartoon. We had so many protests, the student government asked me to come before them and apologize to the school because I needed to be educated. And I suddenly realized all this time I'd been writing, I did opinion pieces, nobody really cared, but you draw one cartoon and everybody hates you. Now, what a great forum for my views.
So my favorite is Sarah Rose Siskin. And we had her on twice, as Tim said, once by herself and the other with her father, Larry Siskin, in a podcast called Siskin versus Siskin. So Sarah Rose Siskin, she was a former intern of ours, but now she's a writer and a humorist. Think of her as the next generation of humorists coming after PJ O'Rourke. She's the only person I know who has been on Letterman. Back when she was in high school, her little group won a spot on Letterman because they won the Piedmont bird calling contest.
The amount of controversy a joke might inspire has to be proportional to how funny it is. If you're going to make, if somebody's recently diagnosed with cancer and you're going to make a joke about it, it's got to be funny. It can't just be pointing out the fact that something terrible has befallen somebody. If it's a really good joke, it will end up having that person feel better. It'll be a type of medicine. There's a type of comedy, it's called Juvenalian satire, which is the type of insult comedy we're used to. And that can be good. It can be fun. It can be a way of humbling people, uniting people, leveling a field. But it has to be funny.
Bro, I thought that was very interesting. When you think about the controversy over Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock and some of the others who have been, quote, victims of cancel culture, I think that's a healthy perspective to take into mind when evaluating these cases. Is it really cancel culture, or was it really just an unfunny joke backfiring?
That's right. We're going to have Sarah Siskin back to talk about these issues. So our next category is media talking heads. And among my favorites was syndicated columnist Deborah Saunders. I love the interview with Deborah because she really gave us the inside scoop on what it was like to cover the Trump administration. She also had these insights on the contrasting reaction of COVID in California versus COVID and the rest of the country, and especially some of the southern states like Florida and what they all thought of COVID and how they didn't lock down as long as we did. So here's Deborah Saunders.
Everybody thought that Biden getting in, he'd be really boring and not as much work. Well, guess what? He's a president. So you may not have the drama that you had with Donald Trump, but with Joe Biden, you get a lot of policies. A new White House comes in, you have to break in the team and they break you in, just as happened to me. So when I started covering the Trump White House, I'd never been a reporter before. I'd been an editorial writer and a columnist. And here I am in this crazy beat. And the Trump people, a lot of really great people in that group who, and they know who they are. But they also were there to serve Donald Trump. And they felt that that was a special thing about Trump. Not all of them necessarily had the kind of background that you're seeing with the Biden people. And the Biden people, yeah, they're there to serve Joe Biden, make no mistake about it. And they're going to be very protective of him and loyal to him. But you can also feel that there's a sense of they're representing the institution of the White House as well. And a lot of these folks, like Jen Psaki, they've been in government before. They just have a more professional way of dealing things in terms of a routine.
One of my favorite media talking heads was our interview with Tom Rogan. And Tom Rogan is a very interesting guy. He's been a writer an editor with the Washington Examiner. But one of the most interesting things about Tom Rogan is that he kind of got his big break as a researcher for the late, great John McLaughlin, and later a panelist on the McLaughlin group. And ultimately, he helped to revive the McLaughlin group for a time and serve in the John McLaughlin chair after his death.
Well, I was sending out emails to comments at McLaughlin.com asking if I could come on. And eventually, thanks to one of McLaughlin's longtime producers, John Roberts, who recommended me to McLaughlin when he asked, I was given a shot there. And I quickly formed a bond with John. I think, as an American who grew up abroad, grew up in England, obviously, one of the things that's why John liked me and I liked working with him is that he reminded me of his background as a sort of Jesuit teacher, and his sort of eccentricity in some ways reminded me of sort of dealing with some of my teachers at school and certain headmasters. So, for example, with John, he was quite demanding in terms of scripts. Sometimes I worked with him on the intros to each issue. I did this as well as being a panelist, which some people didn't realize. But if I screwed something up or there was something he didn't like or it wasn't good enough, I could sometimes get a profanity-laden call and very, angry. But I liked that because I knew it came from a position of, he was utterly dedicated to the quality of what he produced to his viewers, and he knew he was giving me an opportunity.
Our final kind of category here are campaigns and elections, and we certainly have talked a lot about what and who are on the ballot over the years. One very interesting podcast that we taped on location while I was at the Heritage Resource Bank conference in Arizona was with Scott Rasmussen, the noted national pollster. And I talked with him. It was kind of a data deep dive. There's a lot of criticism over the methodology and accuracy of polling today. And he talked about how changes in the polling industry have impacted the field as a whole and his work.
What I think is going to happen is over the next few years, as we evolve this, polling is going to face some trials. Polling is going to miss in some places, and we'll hear, oh my gosh, the world is coming to an end. But that's because we have to experiment. We have to keep changing, and we have to learn what works.
That was a really good get, Tim. That was a great interview. Well, I want to move on here to, our coverage of the campaigns and the elections. So listeners might know that there are actually three of us who were former political speechwriters. Tim wrote for various legislators, as well as Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Lance Izumi wrote for Attorney General Ed Meese, and I wrote for Governor Wilson. I was also a research assistant in President Reagan's speechwriting staff. So we've got a lot of expertise here. And one thing that we like to do is to cover the speeches at the conventions, and also Governor Newsom's speech, and also, whoever is in power, whether it's President Trump or President Biden. And well, our Lance just cannot bear to go through all of those speeches, especially from the liberals. So here's Lance.
And I thought the best moment of the convention was the end.
This was certainly a chore to sit through 4 nights and 2 hours each night. I wanted to, to nickname this podcast, We Watched It So You Don't Have to. But join us next week. We're going to do it again.
That was a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.
I can't wait.
That was pretty good.
You could just hear Lance's agony. And he's actually made us promise that never again will we watch all 4 nights of the convention.
So here's a montage of some of our political predictions over the years, and most of us have pretty much missed the mark. Predictions, as the great John McLaughlin would have said. Will Obamacare be repealed and replaced in 2018? I'm going to be optimistic and say yes, because in the think tank business, you've got to be optimistic. Next prediction. Who will control Congress after the 2018 elections? Lance?
I think that it's going to be the Republicans. I do think that, assuming that the president signs a tax bill, I think that's going to end up being very popular. It'll give the Republicans something to run on and point to. And so I think that, the Republicans still keep control of Congress by a slight margin in the Senate, though.
And for our last prediction, who will be the next governor of California? Tim?
Well, I think this is going to be a case of the tortoise and the hare. And I think in this environment of Me Too, and you have two Democratic frontrunners who have lots of problems with women that have not yet been thoroughly scrutinized by the news media, I'd put my money on State Treasurer John Chung.
Who will be the Democratic nominee for president?
Elizabeth Warren.
And I believe that President Trump will not only win, but mark my words, he will win in a landslide.
Hillary Clinton is going to be the Democratic nominee for president. She's chomping at the bit to run, and as this Democratic field is, no one's putting it away, I predict you'll see a Hillary announcement sometime in the early part of the year. Clearly, don't take what we say and run to Las Vegas and play.
I want to salvage this situation. I have been on record, and you didn't use this clip, Tim, but I have been on record warning of Kamala Harris and how know her here in California. And now she's on the national stage, and now the nation knows how she is. Well, also, you didn't pick my other clip, which was a great, really fantastic prediction of mine, which is young Adam, who I named as Free Marketer of the Year with his subversive lemonade stand in San Francisco. Well, now Adam is in high school, and he just wrote a great op-ed at the San Francisco Chronicle on the state of education post-COVID. It's very alarming, and everyone should really check it out. My best prediction.
Well, as we close, our favorite question that we ask all of our guests is to share their favorite beer, wine, cocktail, or otherwise recommendation. We started asking this question because, we don't normally drink while recording these episodes. We do love nothing more than discussing public policy issues while enjoying a great adult beverage, usually a glass of some California-grown wine. But sometimes our guests have some very interesting answers when it comes to their recommendations. So here are a few of the more unique answers that people have given when sharing their cocktail recommendations.
I love sugary things, so my favorite drink is actually a root beer freeze, which is, for those who don't know, is root beer mixed with usually soft serve, vanilla ice cream, and all mixed up like a milkshake.
I am a huge root beer fan. There's a number that I like. Probably the top one would be River City root beer. I just buy it here locally, and it is very, very tasty. Typically, I like a root beer with cane sugar in it, a little vanilla, and it is.
My wife always gives me a bad time because I don't have any real sense of smell, and so I don't really have a very good sense of taste. And so I prefer beer as long as it's cold. And so what I prefer then is, as long as all the beer tastes the same to me, I might as well get the cheap beer. And so if I were to go out and buy a 24-pack, I buy natural ice. As I say, every day is Saturday.
I have developed what I call the cheap wine neck syndrome, and that means my head is always craned downward to the lower shelf in the grocery stores looking at the cheapest wine to buy. After a few years of this, your head kind of gets in that permanent position, and your neck hurts a little bit.
Well, I can't say that I share Carrie's approach to wine buying, but it's good to see that people have very unique taste in their approaches to what they consume to let the stress of a busy day go by.
Yeah, and I also want to point out that, yes, in contrast to Carrie, our Carrie Jackson, that was the last clip, Michael Anton, who is quite posh and is a foodie and a wine connoisseur, recommended a Clos de Val, which I don't believe there was any bottle that was under $100.
Well, with that, I think we should toast 5 great years of Next Round.
Yes, and got to thank our audience for 5 great years and for sticking with us throughout the years, and hopefully another 5 more. Thanks very much. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.